Thank you so much. That's a very generous introduction. Uh, as you mentioned today, I'm going to be talking about, as you posted before, about mythology. What is myth? How is myth utilized in Sikh scripture, or is it not utilized? What role does it play in the Sikh tradition? And I think this type of discussion is very polarizing. People usually fall on the extremes of each side. Some say, these mythic stories are impossible. They're beyond the realm of science, physics, logic. Therefore, couldn't be possible. Sikh shouldn't believe in that. Others say, well, if you had a stronger faith, then you would believe in these stories, that they could manifest in such a way. But my talk here is going to really introduce another approach, which doesn't even engage really with these questions about plausibility of myth. Rather, it engages with what the myth or the story is trying to tell us, the truth that emerges from the myth. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover 5 stories, and we're going to see their relevance in Gurbani, in Sikh literature, in Sikh scripture, and in Sikh history, ethos. So we're going to see the commonality between these stories. We're going to see the effect that they have, and we're also going to see the purpose for them. So I wanted to start off just by showing you 5 images related to the 5 stories. And I want the audience now to kind of step back a little from their mind and sort of witness the thoughts that arise when viewing these images. I'll just share my screen. This is the half lion, half man, Narasimha tearing apart Harnakish. Put a halad there on the side. Oops. This is the white bull who sustains the earth in Islamic cosmology, in medieval Islamic cosmology. This is a Persian manuscript. The almost ancient, very old folklore story of Hir Ranja in Punjabi literature, very well known, depicting Hir and Ranja here. A painting from Baba Atal Gurdwara in Amritsar, depicting Guru Nanak here meeting with a personified form of Kaljug, of the Dark Age. And the iconic headless warrior, Baba Deep Singh, an 18th century Sikh warrior whose story is well known within the Sikh community. Okay, so, when we were viewing this image, what thoughts come to mind? I want to ask the audience here, what is this picture depicting? What is the flavor or flavors that this painting is exuding? What questions come to mind when we look at this? Do we think, oh, this looks Hindu to me. This is supposed to be about Sikhi and the myth. How is this relevant? They might even feel an aversion to this image, something that makes them uncomfortable about it because to them it represents a different tradition or religion. Do we think, oh, did this really happen? Half man, half lion, Narasimha, as he's known in Indic tradition, specifically the Vaishnava tradition. Did this really happen? If so, when did it happen? What's the exact date? Who was the king that he's tearing apart? Surely, if it was a king, he would have had scribes. They could have written about this. How can we correlate all this information to kind of pin down a time? I'm going to argue, though, in this talk that these types of questions for such a painting, for such imagery, for such a story, they are not beneficial. And not only that, they are not even relevant. One might want to know that information if they're interested in an evidentiary approach to the collection of information in order to maybe fit that information through the filter of rational logic to give it legitimacy in order to bring it into one's belief system. And that is a powerful and useful approach. It's an approach utilized in the legal system. These types of inquiry are useful in a courtroom where findings are based off of evidence to reach a level of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But notably, that style of writing is quite different than poetry. And we know this, that there are stylistic differences in poetry and legal documents or textbooks. We just may not explicitly acknowledge it. But this type of lens, that type of evidentiary lens, is not useful in the field or in the realm of art, in the realm of literature and storytelling, narration, poetry, and philosophy, which all transcend and blend notions of reality in order to convey a certain truth or message, which may be absorbed in a way that can be tasted or experienced in a far deeper manner than just intellectually grasping something. So these stories, these myths, are literary devices that are employed. And this is a core idea I want everyone to hang on to as we dive into these stories. And to show you how this works, we're going to go and we're going to look through these examples that are within Sikh scripture, Gurbani, and ethos, history, all of which I'm going to show come from different traditions, come from Indic tradition, come from Islamic tradition, come from Punjabi folklore. This particular one comes from Indic tradition. So Narsingha or Narsimha, considered to be an incarnation of God of Vishnu, who manifests out of a pillar into this half lion, half man to save the devotee who we see here on the left side, Prahlad, from his father, the king, who is being torn up here. Artwork depicting this type of story can be seen from the 4th century, so over like 1700 years ago. It's an ancient story popularized in the Vaishnava community. There are mandars associated with Narsingha. There are Purans written, Purans being Sanskrit texts written outlining his story, his myth, all of which suggests, well, that this myth, like many other in Indic tradition, have no connection with Sikhi. What is the connection? But as we're going to see here in Sikh scripture, Gurbani, it utilizes this myth in this passage here. And this passage is going to be familiar with a lot of the audience. I suspect it's sung every morning when Asa Divar is performed at the end. It's also generally included at the beginning of the evening prayer, Reheras. The first line sets out the premise of the entire verse that, in all ages, and this is an idiom being used here in the line, jug jug, meaning the 4 ages, but represents, one full time cycle in Indic thought. That the divine manifests both their devotees and the means for their protection. And the next 2 lines in this passage utilize myth to demonstrate that, taken from popular culture, from the myth that the audience was familiar with at that time. And here we see the image to the left on the screen being painted by the Guru, by Guru Ramdas. So on the left side of the screen, we see Prahlad, and that points back to the first portion of the first line, which represents the philosophical point that devotees are created. This is a statement which implicitly teaches us that those who become devotees of the divine are not achieving that status from their own will, that this is a blessing, that it is one's fortune, thus removing any sense of agency which would sprout arrogance in one's association with being a devotee or being Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, etc. And the second part of that first line is also conveyed in this imagery that the Guru paints in the second line, that the divine protects his devotees, here represented through the imagery of Narsingha tearing apart Haranakish. So we can see how here the myth of Narsingha is being utilized to paint that philosophical point, just like how the third line does that. So, the second line, Haranaksha dusht harmarya prahlad draya. And this is according to the painting here. But the third line, ahankarya nindka pit de nam deo mukalaya. And this line, the third line, is representing a story where Namdev, the Bhagat from the 13th century, how he went to a mandir. It's located in Maharashtra. He was kicked out of that mandir because he was perceived to be a lower caste. The local pandits kicked him out. Yet Namdev was so devoted, he didn't get upset at the divine for that and headed just behind the mandir, where he continued his devotional practice, his his singing the praises of the divine. And according to the story, the mandir itself turned around facing Namdev, as the reference here in the third line points to, turning its back on the Pandits, on the slanderers of Namdev. So emphasizing both points mentioned in the first line as well. And then the last line here makes a point about these devotees, that referencing Prahlad and Namdev, that those who serve the divine in such a way, they are liberated. Another interesting point here is that the terms used for divine, you can see how the word Ram Raje, the King Ram, is utilized here, very Vaishnava terminology, which falls in line with the myth associated with it. Also, the idea that Vishnu takes birth, incarnates, has avatars, which come down to save the world, and their devotees. So this entire idea is being utilized in this package, and it's being repurposed here to provide comfort, reassurance to the devotee reading this. And well, you can imagine that somebody reading this in the evening time for Reharaz after a long day at his job, at a job that he deems noble, but it's just really tough, that this job being almost an act of devotion, as he has framed it within this Sikh notion of Kirat Kamai, honest hard work. The reader, when he's engaging with this, is thrown into a world of stories which engage and represent this concept that he will be protected to continue to serve and love the divine without any regard to the pains that come along with it. And we can see how these mythic metaphors are framed within the first and last passage of this passage. So one important notion that I want to illustrate in this talk is that the utilization of particular references itself does not necessarily represent an endorsement to the historical accuracy of these events or figures, but more so are related to its symbolism, to substantiate the points made by the Guru. Nor does the referencing mean that the Sikh tradition is tied to a particular religious tradition or their myth. So it does not mean the Sikh tradition is directly linked only to the Vaishnava community in terms of myth. And to demonstrate this point, I want to look at some other symbolism that gets utilized, which comes out of the medieval Islamic world. Here we see a manuscript from medieval India written in Persian, Farsi, showing on the right side a white bull holding up the world on his back. When we look at this reference, we may not think of Guru Nanak, but this reference is in Guru Nanak's Japji Sahib, which Sikhs recite every day. And this reference finds mention there. So in Japji Sahib, Guru Nanak writes, Tol taram daya ka put, santok tab rakhya jinsut. That the mythical bull, this Tol, that holds up the entire world, is Taram. It's righteousness, for lack of a better translation. And that, Taram comes out of what? It's the son of compassion, Daya Kaput. Santok Tab Rakha Jinsut. And that which binds the bull to the entire world, that is Santok, that is contentment. So the question here is, what bull is that we see here that Guru Nanak is referencing? Well, in medieval Islamic cosmology, and that's something that not currently is still held in high esteem, I believe, in the Islamic world, to my knowledge. But at one point, in a certain strand of Islamic cosmology, the white bull, called Kuyuta, I may be pronouncing that wrong, it's an Arabic word, it was seen as the bull that supported the entire world. Presumably Guru Nanak was writing to an audience which is well aware of this idea, and hence the utilization of it in this mythic metaphor. But this point and idea is very important and interesting because in other points of Gurbani, there's mention of more Indic versions of this myth, and that the world is supported by a snake. In Indic mythology, the snake, Sheshnag, the divine snake who forever recites and praises the divine through new names, and how he's unable to ever come to the end of, finding new names for the divine, noting how the praise of the divine is inexhaustible. There's no end to it. So in Indic mythology, we have that myth. But the fact that we have both used as metaphors, some argue from two polar opposite traditions, point to the natural, conclusion that, there's something deeper going on here, that these mythic metaphors and stories are being utilized to explain concepts. It should demonstrate that the point of them is not to convey a certain level of endorsement to their respective traditions to legitimize the truth of such a concept, but rather to point to a deeper truth, repurposing the myth to convey, as scholars have called it, a meta truth. And in this way, it's true, not in the fact that such a bull or snake exists. And I don't mean to criticize or promote either sides of that argument. That argument, that this story isn't true in a literal sense, is not relevant for this approach. The idea of truth, though, is important. For Sikhs, we hold Gurbani, or the writings of the Gurus, to be, the absolute pinnacle of truth, Sachi Bani, the true word. But when we normally engage with Gurbani, it's more from the lens of examining it as a legal document, a textbook, without actually realizing, that this is written specifically as poetry in meter, utilizing idioms, utilizing proverbs, utilizing the language of narration, of myth, all of which to induce a feeling of flavor, a ras, an experience, rather than a conceptual idea, as the divine in Sikh thought is beyond any conceptual way to grasp it. As Guru Gobind Singh writes at the beginning of his Japa Sahib, he writes, Anapo Prakash, the divine becomes illuminated. One experiences it only through one's Anubhav, only through one's, experience. One engages with the divine experientially. Speaking of Guru Gobind Singh, we're going to look at this example here, Hir Ranja. This idea of repurposing a myth, utilizing the flavor, the ras, emotion, feeling that a certain myth or story holds is demonstrated in this next story. Hir Ranja, the famed Punjabi folk story, made famous by Varis Shah in the middle of the 18th century, but it was well known even before that, and there are earlier versions than that. The story was known to many Punjabis, and the utilization of its gripping story of love was utilized in a beautiful passage written by Guru Gobind Singh, which is well known to many as well. This Shabad here, Mitra Pyare Nu Hal Murida Da Kehna. This passage here, though, it reveals itself at the end. It provides that context to show that it's related to Hir Ranja with the line at the end, that, living with the Kheras is like living in a furnace. It puts into context that first part, Bitter Pyare Nu, oh my lover, oh my friend Ranja. So this is Hir speaking here. And, that I'd hear saying that, I'd rather be with you than anything else, regardless of the pains that come along with it. Because, without you, anything in this world seems dismal, painful, and torturous, as you can see in the next few lines here. And in the same way, Guru Gobind Singh is using this mythic folklore in a way to demonstrate the divine lover's state of being, but it only makes sense if we understand that context. It only has that penetrating force and flavor when we understand the context. And without understanding the mythic or folk components of the metaphors, analogies, and references that are made, you just don't have that enjoyment. The enjoyment's severely restricted when you engage with Gurbani without that insight. And in the same way, when we look at this story, there's a lot of different stories, a lot of different versions of the story, but the main element remains the same across them, that it's a story which emphasizes deep pain and longing for a beloved. And because of that, Guru Gobind Singh utilizes it here in this analogy, in this metaphor. It should be noted as well that Sikh commentators, when speaking about the historical context of this Shabad, the Uttanaka, they say that Guru Gobind Singh recited this Shabad when in Mashiwada jungle, all alone, having lost his city of Anandpur Sahib, separated from his family and his Sikh warriors. His feet was, riddled with thorns. He didn't eat in such a long time. In all of those pains, Guru Gobind Singh recited this. This is mentioned in Gurbalas Pasha Dasmi by Kaur Singh, written in 1751, the earliest full life biography we have of Guru Gobind Singh. And for those who know the story of Hir Ranja, that'll immediately mark a parallel with them, as they know that Hir would go into the forest to meet with Ranja. Now, this isn't the only Uttanka for the Shabad. In Guru Pratap Suraj Prakash, it mentions Guru Gobind Singh reciting this Shabad when his beloved, his Pyara, Daya Singh, passes away. But again, we see this connection with one's beloved. And again, the point here isn't that this is a validation of everything within the Hir Ranja story, or that that story actually happened and occurred. It's besides the point in the usage here. The usage is to emphasize a certain emotion, symbolism, flavor, ras, or philosophical point that is the truth in the story itself. This next image here is a fresco from Baba Atal Gurdwara in Amritsar. We're moving out of now Sikh scripture, Gurbani. We're traveling now into the world of ethos, or history of the Sikh Gurus. So in Janam Sakhi literature, there's life stories of Guru Nanak, along with the stories written by Gurdas. We hear a lot of mythic content. That has made a lot of people uncomfortable for a very long time. But I'm going to argue here that when Sikh writers are penning down their stories for the Guru, their narration of the events of the Guru, they're doing it in the same way that Sikh scripture was written, utilizing myth to draw out a wider and a more important point in a way that philosophically conveys an idea that was quite standard for storytelling and narration, both back then and now when we look at stories. So here we see Guru Nanak meeting with Kaljug. In Indic mythic thought, there are 4 ages of the world for one time cycle. Most people in the Sikh tradition are aware of this. It's mentioned extensively in texts. The current age we are in is called the Dark Age, Kali Yuga, written often as Kaljug. And this image here depicts a meeting which is written in the history of Guru Nanak, that he meets with Kaljug, who is personified here. He has taken a bodily form, which is dark. He has this army of vices standing behind him to the right, you can see in the corner. They approach Guru Nanak with clasped hands, humbly requesting that, oh, Guru Nanak, you've blessed everyone. Why have you not blessed me? Guru Nanak is pleased with that humble approach. And it says here on the caption that Guru Nanak blesses Kaljug with the blessing that his age will be the most powerful. It'll have the most effect on people, albeit a negative effect. So then, what does this story support? We can ask, if we think about it a little deeper, we can realize implicitly, meaning without having it say it overtly, that it's telling us that the divine, as represented in Guru Nanak, is the cause of all action. He holds all agency, all power in the world. And if vices and hypocrisy have such a great effect on the world at a specific time, well, then that's still divinely orchestrated. It's still within the hands of the divine, like everything else. And this point takes us back to Guru Nanak's concept of hukum, the divine plan. In Japji Sahib, hukum and sabko bahram hukum na koi, that everyone, everything, good, bad, ugly, is under the command of the divine. It's a really positive way of looking at the world and points us to the experience that we should aim for, to live in Bhagna, in the will of the divine. This is the meta truth that the image is conveying. Whether it's true or false in a historical sense is outside the point here. It's speaking to a philosophical idea. It's teaching us. So myth can be used to teach us, but it can also be used to inspire us. This is another effect that mythic stories have on listeners. Who doesn't know of the story of Baba Deep Singh in Sikh history? Baba Deep Singh, the great Sikh warrior who fought to free Harmandir Sahib in 1757, giving his head there in battle. The story of Baba Deep Singh spread far and wide and was written down by Gyani Gyan Singh in the Pant Prakash Naveen Pant Prakash in 1880. Gyani Gyan Singh, an avid historian, writing how Baba Deep Singh fought so valiantly that during battle, even though his head was chopped off, he continued fighting, grabbing his head with his left hand, his Khanda sword in his right hand, and he just continued forward till he got to Harmandir Sahib. Now, I've talked about this story in the past. You can search on YouTube. Um, I mentioned how the story has many parallels with the story written by Guru Gobind Singh in the Dasam Granth called the Kharag Singh Prasang, the story of the king Kharag Singh, who fights headless against Krishna and the gods, defeating them all with his indomitable spirit, setting an ideal for the Khalsa warrior that no matter what happens, even if one's head comes off, they'll continue to fight on to fight the good fight. So in the Kharag Singh story written by Guru Gobind Singh, Kharag Singh also picks up his head with his left hand after it's cut off. He throws that head, his own head, at Krishna, who he's fighting against, who's on a chariot. That he throws it so hard it knocks Krishna off his chariot, and Krishna gets knocked out. Then he walks up to Shiva. He doesn't have a head at this point, and slaps Shiva down, humiliating him. It's a very powerful story. And that story then gets refracted onto a story of one of the greatest Sikh warriors in the 18th century, Baba Deep Singh. Sikhs were associating Baba Deep Singh with that same ideal written by Guru Gobind Singh. The point, whether this happened or not happened, that's not relevant. The point is that the story is fostering an ethos, is bolstering a mindset that one will never be conquered, an ideal expressly mentioned throughout Guru Gobind Singh's writings. Also should be noted that Baba Deep Singh, by the way, he's also said to have had written many swarups, many copies of Guru Gobind Singh's writings, the Dasam Granth, and sent them to various takhats. So I'm arguing here that this type of narration, this language in which they play, facilitates the explanation and demonstration of truth through historical telling, which is extremely powerful and which captures the mind of those who hear it. As Amadi mentioned, the Suraj podcast, for those who don't know, I'll just recap it a little bit here, is a chapter by chapter recap of the Suraj Prakash text written by Kavi Santokh Singh, completed in 1843. Currently, we're looking at the stories of Guru Hargobind. And the way the Suraj Prakash, the text, is written links directly in the way in which Gurbani utilized myth and how earlier Sikh writers were conveying events of the Sikh Gurus and their esteemed Sikhs as well. One example I want to mention, which comes up on the podcast, is when Guru Hargobind has his third battle, which was covered from episodes 14 to 24. When the Mughal armies, when they came against Guru Hargobind in that battle, the commanders sent them in great haste. They did it all of a sudden, without preparing properly, without getting supplies like heavier coats for the soldiers to keep them warm. The battle happened in winter time. It's quite cold. They didn't assess the weather conditions. They made a lot of mistakes because they were arrogant, and the decision was made in haste. So the way the Suraj Prakash talks about the battle was that Guru Hargobind summoned Pawan Devta, the god of wind in Indic mythology, who brings with him then the cold air of the Himalayas to freeze the hands of the Mughal soldiers, resulting in them not being able to fire their matchlock rifles. Now, if you know how matchlock rifles are ignited, how they work, you know that if it's cold and windy, it's going to be a problem unless you have a proper setup. The text mentions how, the entrenched stations of the Sikhs had, pockets of fire there to warm up the soldiers, to keep the fire on their wicks lit so that they could fire off their rifles efficiently. The Mughals, though, the soldiers were not prepared, so they were not as fortunate, resulting in the Sikhs fending them off, even though the Sikhs were greatly outnumbered. Now, to an audience who doesn't know how matchlock rifles work, the throwing in of all of that detail might confuse or distract from the point, or just won't grip their attention in a storytelling manner. But when this is done through this language of narration, the author is able then to speak to a broad audience and is able to embed within that story a range of ideas as well. There are philosophical ideas couched in this style of narration as well, that Guru Hargobind, the Guru is, the divine, and that the divine has all elements, all aspects of creation under his control. Also that the divine orchestrates all. So if cold wind came there, well, then that was orchestrated by Guru Hargobind. Such texts like Suraj Prakash they follow in line with these previous writings in Gurbani. This text is not an outlier in that regard. This is embedded in the culture of storytelling, both then and I'll argue even today. This is why I feel like the feedback for the podcast has been really interesting. Been getting messages like, they feel that when listening to these stories, they're actually there. Like, these stories bring those moments to life, the way it's narrated. It makes the guru feel more human. And that's an interesting one, because in these stories, there are a lot of mythic stories in there, which one would think would do the opposite. But when they're told in such a way, they take along with them, the flavor, the rust, the symbolism, the meaning behind them in such a subtle way that it becomes hard to understand that language, what it's actually doing if you're not consciously engaged with it. But you are still engaging with that flavor, and you still enjoy it to such a large degree. A whole different world opens up if you start to engage with this type of language, of narration. You won't just whitewash parts of Gurbani because a reference comes up about Indic tradition or Islamic tradition, because of one's limited understanding of cultural boundaries. You'll begin to engage with Gurbani and ethos in a more pre-colonial manner, and one that was filled with rich storytelling and poetry styles, and that ones were engaged with, and that I'll argue was the culture at that time, and was done to make things more relevant to the listener. This isn't a new take on these type of stories either. Sun Singh Maskeen, a great Sikh scholar who studied under a traditional learning institution, the Nirmalas, has said very often in his katha and his discourse that myth is utilized in Gurbani and Itihas as a way to explain to listeners, to readers. It's a device. We have commentaries, tika, which explain these antriv arth, the inner or deeper meaning of these stories. And this has been a way to analyze and engage with these stories for a very long time. The world that opens up is endlessly more satisfying, and I really encourage everyone to look deeper for truth of a story instead of just examining it superficially with bias or prejudice against the tradition which the poetry or story makes reference to. So if you're going to take away one idea from today's talk, I would say that don't discount or disregard stories just because perhaps they lack evidentiary basis for repeatability of what you consider reality. Instead, look to the meta truths that they wish to convey, such that you can absorb the specific ideas communicated through these rich cultural vehicles that span traditions, religions, and perhaps time itself. And with that, I want to open up to questions and have a discussion.
Jvala, thank you very much. Wonderful. I've got you back. Thank you for that. That was as ever fascinating. I loved what you said quite early on. Actually, you said these are literary devices, and the opposite, of course, is they are not literal devices. They are literary. I remember the first time I came across the story of, in the Buddhist tradition, that Buddha as a child was shielded by the hood of a cobra. The sun was shaded from him by the hood of a cobra, and thinking, wait a second, I know that story. That's from the life of Guru Nanak, but clearly it's a literary device that's been used through the ages. And I think the same goes with the Baba Deep Singh story. You did a great talk, and maybe you just want to praise it, if you don't mind, on the Khadak Singh story. I don't know if you can do that. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but it just, for me, that there's a tradition of using that idea of a warrior, an indomitable warrior, using his head as a weapon to talk about devotion and talk about rather than the literally, man fighting without his head. Do you want to say a few words on that Khadak Singh story, or am I delving far too far in the recesses of your research?
No, I think for those who want to have a listen of that, you can go to the Mangalacharan YouTube page. There is that recording. I presented that at Stanford University. Jakarta movement had organized this talk there called Scholars. I did a paper at university talking about Kharak Singh Prasang. It's very interesting because Guru Gobind Singh, when writing that story within his Krishna avatar, so that story is embedded within a larger text called the Krishna avatar, the life stories of Krishna, specifically from the Dasam Granth, the 10th canto, the 10th chapter, if you would, from the Bhagavad Purana. Now, Guru Gobind Singh is rewriting that. He's doing a retelling, if it were, in a different language. So the Bhagavad Purana is written in Sanskrit. Guru Gobind Singh's version, Krishna Avatar, is written in Braj Bhasha. So it was a poetic thing at the time. A lot of Braj Bhasha poets were writing their retellings of the Bhagavad Purana. But what makes Guru Gobind Singh's version so interesting is that he's included passages in there, and this is what you mentioned, the Kharak Singh Prasang, the story of Kharak Singh, which doesn't find any reference anywhere else. So he's repurposing this myth of Krishna and embedding within it a story about this indomitable warrior called Kharak Singh. How he even beats the gods. This is kind of setting out an ideal of the warrior, that no matter who you're facing against, you're facing against the kings, you're facing against whoever, it doesn't matter. If you are devoted to a certain ideal, then that you can achieve that, even if half your body's cut up. So Guru Gobind Singh, in doing that, is drawing from old Sanskrit literature as well. That's not an idea that originates with Guru Gobind Singh. He's making it more fun and more enjoyable in a Sikh context. There are Sanskrit texts which talk about warriors who fight without their heads, and a specific term in Sanskrit for that, like a torso which fights. But for more details, you can watch that video. But yeah, Guru Gobind Singh is drawing from the literature, the myth at the time, repurposing it, and creating his own in a way. And in the same way, that's what I'm arguing here, is that Sikh writers are doing the same. When you said, oh, you saw the Buddha with the snake over his head, I was really shocked when, if you look up, I believe I'm correct, if you look up the life stories of Kabir, the way he passes away, and they put a sheet over him, and then they open the sheet and the flowers are there, mimics a lot of how we retell the passing of Guru Nanak as well. And that obviously predates Guru Nanak. So we can see how ideas, move through time, how certain ideas are they land really well, they're absorbed really well. And this is why I think the Suraj Prakash is so interesting, is because, since its inception in 1843, Santokh Singh takes it to Akal Takht. He presents it there as a gift to the community. They're looking at this text and they're blown away. They're like, this is fantastic. This is insane. They start mandating that all the takhats, all the, institutional heads have to do katha of this. And, this has not been pushed just through authority. When people start listening to this text, there's a reason why it's been over 150 years that this text has survived and it's been absorbed so deeply by the listeners. It just has such a fantastic way of narration and a way in which embeds Sikh philosophy within it. So I guess the point of all of that is that, if we don't engage with this language of narration, these tools, these devices, we're missing out, on a whole different world. So yeah, I hope that answered it.
That was great. Actually, it wasn't a question. It was just my response to your talk, as you kind of go this notion of the literary device versus the literal reading of things. All right, let's move over to questions. There's been lots of questions gone in. I've managed to kind of move some of them around a little bit, but we've got two people with their hands up. So if you've been on these calls before, you know that if you put your hand up on Zoom, then I can open the line to you. And we've got a couple of people already, so I'm just going to go to those first, and then I'll work on the questions in the background. Jassa Aluwalia. It could even be the famed 18th century Sikh missile leader, but more likely it's our friend. So let me unmute you, Jassa. How do I do this? Here we go. Jassa, over to you.
Hello, I'm here encamped with the Dark Arts Army. Hey, Jvala, I was curious. It's a good question actually. The Gagandeep Singh mentions in the Q&A. Um, is there a link to Carl Jung's archetypes? And as I said, that I hope you get to this because I feel like Joseph Campbell discusses it a lot in his comparative mythology work. And I was just curious to ask, you know, do you have a take on Joseph Campbell's comparative mythology works? I feel like there's a lot of crossover with what's been discussed today. And do you think there's any value in examining his work or using some of his work to examine Sikh history and mythology? I'm just curious if that's something you're interested in, because that's something that when I finished reading A Hero with a Thousand Faces, I was like, I really wanted to. He touches on some Indic mythology, but I felt there was just so much there in that is very Sikh specific to be mined and examined. And I feel like you're probably the only person I know who would be able to speak to that.
And before you,
That's a good.
can you explain a little bit more context for those of us that aren't familiar with that?
Oh, so Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, sort of a seminal work of comparative mythology, which was sort of the blueprint for the Star Wars films. It's also reflected in the Harry Potter films of the idea of he went and examined lots of world cultures and distilled this idea of the hero's journey, which is of somebody who goes on a quest, who maybe takes on like a magical implement, an artifact, like be it a lightsaber, a wand, or there's all sorts of other examples in Greek mythology. They go in on this great sort of magical journey, which essentially is a destruction of the self, and then they come back into the world, sort of, I guess, enlightened. And this story sort of manifests, and what he argues is that this story manifests in various myths in different forms all over the world. And the way it interacts with Carl Jung's archetypes is his essential argument is that these stories are all a sort of a reflection of the human mind and psyche, and that's essentially where there is truth in it, is because this is, I guess, the meta truth I think that you were talking about, Jvala. I just think I've not come across many other people who are doing or have done work in this area, and so I guess that's why I was really interested to hear what if you had thoughts on that work.
It's a good question, and I think a lot of people who are educated in a Western education system are going to bring that up. I didn't want to bring that up specifically in this talk, although it does lead to that direction. What, for those who don't know, yeah, Joseph Campbell, these are 20th century thinkers, Carl Jung. These are important thinkers that are trying to engage with this in a similar way. And what they try to do is they try to put a formula on it. Joseph Campbell, he creates this blueprint, which he, in analyzing myths around the world, he's trying to extract the essence to say that, okay, all of them follow a similar pattern, and that pattern can be represented as X. He calls it the hero's myth. He utilizes it in Star Wars. He's a friend of the person who writes and creates Star Wars. And the effect of that, we can all see. Star Wars, the biggest grossing film probably, it's loved by all because it kind of follows, according to Campbell, a certain subconscious desire, or it strikes at a subconscious level that people can all relate to. But I think that's just one lens, and I think that's a lens that is useful. He's engaging with it from a kind of a Western direction, and I think that is useful, but it doesn't cover necessarily all types of certain myths. So you have paradoxical myth, you have stuff written in the Prabochandra Natak or the Prabochandra Udaya in Sanskrit literature. You have, which is an allegorical text. I've done a video on that as well. And you have stuff that doesn't necessarily fit within that framework, but those types of frameworks, like using Carl Jung, using even people use Freud to analyze myth. People use Campbell. There's a really good book I've seen in the questions here. How are you defining myth? I guess if people want to go further in the study for myth, they can look at a book that was recently published, The Anatomy of Myth, and the author's name I have forgotten now, but you can look that up. It's a great book that dissects this. Basically, at the start, I think he says like myth as itself is very difficult to kind of pin down and provide one definition for, because the variety of them. But all of which I wanted to say is that, you know, these are useful tools. Using Campbell, Campbell has written extensively on Indic myth as well. I have that book here somewhere, on Indic art, and you know, his thoughts about what that is trying to do. So people could use those types of works to look at myth, but as I said, from a traditional Sikh learning institution framework, they don't analyze it in that way. Um, but it is useful. And all of which this whole talk was just to say that, you know, you can use different lenses to engage with these myths. So if it's helpful to use Carl Jung to talk about, you know, what is this doing subconsciously, like Guru Nanak, you know, going into the river Vani for 3 days, you know, did he actually dive into that river, or is that a metaphor for one's subconscious, that he was, you know, in solitude and he dove deep into his subconscious, that river of you know, limitless depth, and then finding the divine. And you can put these types of frames on it if it's useful for you. Are we going to say that that's the only meaning? I think that would become problematic if we're trying to say, okay, that's exactly what it is and that's it, if we're trying to limit that. Because Metatruth has a way to apply itself like art across different audiences as well. So for one person, it's going to be viewed in one way. From another person, it's going to be viewed another way. And this is exactly how in traditional learning institutions, in sampradayas, it's Gurbani is understood, is that according to one's you know, composition, disposition, sorry, they're going to react to Gurbani differently, what level they're on, spiritually, emotionally, even. So when when teachers would kind of consult with students, the analogy is given like a doctor. They would kind of see how they talk, where they're at, what type of mindset they're at, and then they'll give them Gurbani in such a way that's almost like prescribing medicine. So it really depends on context, really depends on the individual. If that's a useful lens to you to engage with a lot of these stories, then by all means, I think that's a useful approach.
Thank you very much. That was incredibly comprehensive and wonderful. Thanks.
So thank you very much. Another question from online from Canwell. Canwell, can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you very much. Talking from Canada, and very interesting talk. Lots of ground covered, and the question that arises in my mind is the practical way in which this has been used. And I talk about the different families that we come from, and the talk in the house kind of thing. So the practical on the ground reality of this myth making. And what I've seen and experienced is that the Matama in the house, or the Pitajis in the house, the way I've learned about, I'm going to call these Sakis, is a actual, as if it was happening, just like in a Bollywood movie, that this was a hero and this was a heroic act, and the allegory, the meaning behind it. Unfortunately, my experience has been that that got lost as it was being transmitted to me and to other children in other households. So at an academic level, when we start to pierce through some of these the myths, then sure, for a very select group of people in an academic situation, then it can start to make much more of what the meaning is, and to gain from that. But when it comes to the ground level, at the individual level, at the home level, unfortunately, that the way it has been used has been somewhat not the way I think what you're trying to share. Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, it represents a sentiment that a lot of people have, is that, is this type of talk only for academics? Is this type of approach only for those people who have studied, 4, 5, 10 years in, secondary education? I want to argue that it's exactly the opposite. And I've kind of shown that, um, it's kind of the feedback that I got from Proverbs as well. And, looking through idioms, looking through Proverbs, you might say that, generally, I know it was a case how my mother speaks about my nani, my maternal grandmother, that she used a lot of Proverbs, and she was not educated at all. She was illiterate, but they utilize Proverbs, they utilize idioms, which are not exactly literal, right? They represent something other than what's being said. And in the same way, a lot of these stories can embed within them large philosophical debates and talks, yet they can be so simple, and through this through this language of narration. Perhaps the way in which, I agree with you that, maybe that's not the experience we've had in the past 100 years. And there's a lot of reasons, why that could be, stemming from, almost having a foot in both worlds, through a British education most Sikhs had in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, coming to grips with some of these stories, which they may not deem rational or logical, and then kind of having to tell them in this awkward way, which is why I've put such an emphasis on, when recapping the Suraj Prakash chapters in the podcast, that I do it exactly how the author Santokh Singh desired, and if there's mistakes in there, I really apologize, but I'm really trying to convey how he wrote it. If parts of it doesn't seem, rational or realistic to me, I always just include however he's written it. And that seemed to have landed quite well with people, generally how we see the Suraj Prakash being translated, a lot of details are missed, context is changed, sometimes they change the words itself, and I think that results in more problems than just telling it as it is. So I think one way we can remedy this is teaching our kids, and teaching, and kind of for us to embody this, that we can take a different approach when listening to these stories, and we can gain a lot more by doing that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kendall. Thank you very much. It was an interesting question, and actually echoes something that Harjinder Singh asked, which was, how would you navigate these stories when teaching children in the West? So teaching them, and he goes on to say, teaching them an in-depth narrative like Suraj Prakash without confusing them with more Indic lore, mythology, a context they've just not grown up with, can be confusing, essentially. So I'm just curious what your view is on how do we use these things today, or do we just discard them? Because it does take a skilled storyteller. Otherwise, you're left with these very literal tellings, which I think is the source of much of the issue.
Yeah, it's a problem, right? Because on one hand, teaching kids philosophical, teaching them from like a philosophical treatise, they're not gonna really absorb that. It's really difficult to learn, from something so dense like that. But if we invest in scholars who are able to convey these ideas, I think what we get out of that is that we present to the kids the culture that is represented in Gurbani as well. So if we want these kids to eventually read Gurbani, they have to be, at some point, they have to get involved with that culture. And this is, why I'm here on a, Punjabi Heritage Association, is that these myths, these stories are part of our culture. They're part of our heritage. We don't have to, it could come from a Vaishnava community, it can come from Islamic community. We associate Hir Ranja with Punjabi, but it's largely seen as a Sufi text. We don't have to kind of stray away from these being afraid that our kids are not going to grasp it. I think that's a big issue as well in teaching kids. I think we set the bar really low, so low that the kids have nothing to grasp for, and I think that's doing them a disservice, and that's resulting in a lot of wishy-washy storytelling and all sorts of things being told to our kids from our tradition that I think doesn't have a lasting effect. And we hear about these stories about Baba Deep Singh. Who doesn't at least acknowledge that story to be like, oh, that's a wicked story? Whether we're going to be like, oh, that's actually happened, perhaps his head got half cut off and he held it, perhaps it didn't get cut off. You can think about it however you want, but that's a grip that one has to that story. And then we ask, why aren't the kids attached to the stories? Why are they leaving their culture? It's like, well, when you whitewash things, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, does it have that effect? If you do that, one can wonder. But the effect that the Suraj Prakash has had over 150 years is that it's really engaged with listeners in such a way that people feel like they want to carry that forward. Commentaries are written on that text. It's a text that's been going for so long. The Janam Sakhis, these stories about Guru Nanak, have been told for centuries. Are we going to leave these stories behind? I think by engaging with them, we set the foundation for which then kids are then going to engage with Gurbani. And traditionally, from a Sampradayik point of view, from a traditional learning institution point of view, that's how they would teach students. They would say that the first step is ethos. The first step is teaching these stories, which include this language of narration of myth. And they do that such that prem, love, is built within the kids for Guru Nanak. They say, oh, Guru Nanak is encompasses the whole world. He's the divine, he orchestrates everything. And with that love, then they'll be encouraged to read Gurbani. If they don't have that love for the Guru, then the rationale is, how will they be interested in Gurbani? So I think I hope that answers the question, is that I think it begins that culture learning. Yeah.
Wonderful. No, this has been such a fascinating discussion. Love it. And I've got a feeling that Jvala Singh, who I'm going to take off mute. Oh, Jvala Singh, I have to do something quite peculiar to get you on. So Jvala Singh, sorry, your video has come on. You can
not a problem. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
You switch your video off.
I will do that. I'll do that immediately.
You're welcome to keep it on, but it's the only way that I could get you on was to promote you.
No, not a problem. So actually, I'm glad that I'm able to speak now during this conversation, because Jvala Singh, you've perfectly encapsulated, in your response to Haji Gumbal Singh, almost, the daily dilemma we have. And I put a question in the Q&A about whether we should be a little bit more sort of confident in addressing issues around not muddying the waters, because that's what Gumbal Baji is alluding to, the fact that, do we, with our Western mindset, just dismiss all of these allegories and allusions to myth, or do we accept them? And actually, I'd like to just share with you a short case study, if I have your patience, on how this can work with very young children. So I'll be making some allusions to popular culture, some from the 80s, some more recently, and some from centuries old fables, to just tell you how easily this can be done. So if we just start with Japji Sahib, Munda Santok Sarampat Joli Tyan Ki Kare Baput, which is fantastic, and the evocations in Gurbani are just so beautiful. The images that they evoke in our minds, the allusions to traditions and legends and other schools of philosophy that they touch upon are so fantastic. But to bring that down into this household in the West Midlands, you start with actually, and forgive me, I'm not a huge fan of British-based Bhangra music. I've got to hold my hand up there. But actually, from the 80s, there's a fantastic, well, no, there's a great song, perhaps, which is Sohorori Utte Tenu Labada Pira Nime Kanna Vich Mundara Pake, right? And actually, my kids don't like it. I don't like it, but it's part of our childhood, right? Apana Sangeet, right? And then, so what do those mundara mean, right? Well, immediately, as a fan of Muhammad Rafi, my kids are aware of Heer Ranja, you know, the Hindi film, and there are so many fantastic songs, obviously, Ye Duniya Ye Mehfil Mere Kaam Ki Nahi, right? Where the hero, Bollywood film, walks around with mundara in his ears, and you explain very quickly, very easily, and then of course there's Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan Sahib with Qawwali, and actually you can very quickly and easily string these songs and these, you know, these films and these, you know, all these resources we have available to us today, and to then create the context of what that fantastic line, you know, Munda Santok Saran Pacholi Tyan Ki Kare Babut means, and the same is true with Tao Taram Daya Kaput. So actually, what I'm saying to you is, you know, I'm agreeing with you, Jvala Singh, that we shouldn't be backwards and coming forwards about how easy it is to provide the context, which then allows our children to have a much richer and a much stronger connection with Gurbani, and not see it as this something that then this text that they're not disconnected from. So my suggestion, my humble suggestion, is that actually we should be on the front foot with this, and, you know, address the fact that these are wonderful allusions in the land of Ramayana and Mahabharata, you know, a crossing point of cultures. We should embrace them, but actually also just be unashamed in telling our children what the context is.
Thank you very much for that. Jvala, do you want to respond to that?
It's a beautiful, beautiful connection. It's a connection that I've not even thought about, that song. It's a reference. Those earrings are a reference to becoming a jogi, right? Like becoming a yogi. Ranja, you know, when he's not able to attain Heer, what he does is he roams around taking the form of a yogi. And in doing so, kind of puts earrings. This is a marker, as you mentioned, that line in Japji said, Munda Santok Sanapacholi. So that line is saying, Guru Nanak is saying to the yogis that, you know, make your earrings contentment, Santok. So beautiful reference. And you can see how these references from Heer Ranja are being repurposed for Apana Punjab, for somebody that's roaming around the streets of Birmingham looking for their beloved as well. So you can see how long lasting these ideas are. And that's the point of this, to say that these ideas are so long lasting, as somebody brought up Joseph Campbell, right? And utilizing Joseph Campbell's idea and then kind of creating it, kind of reverse engineering, creating Star Wars from that. You can see this kind of reverse engineering here, where Apana Sangeet is saying, like, this is a beautiful idea of, you know, a beloved becoming a recluse or a renunciate, and, you know, kind of roaming around hoping to see his beloved. So thanks for sharing that. That's beautiful.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry I had to switch your video on. It was a very peculiar thing. You've got an old version of Zoom, and it's the only way I can get you to ask your question. I loved your comment, so thank you very much, and see you at the next one. I'm going to just take a few more of the questions that are actually on the Q&A, because some of them just got a lot of votes. So let's kind of crash through some of these. So Dasam Singh asks, and I'm going to slightly rephrase it, but he says, a common question that often crops up is, did the gurus lend legitimacy to these myths and symbolism by making reference to them? And I'd probably put it a slightly different way. Was it deliberate to give those myths, to give that mythological framework, which is often in a ideology that was often rejected in many respects by the gurus, but to give them legitimacy. Is that very deliberate? Do they kind of know what that was? Was that an expectation?
Sorry, I just had trouble unmuting. But yeah, that's a really important question. Did they give legitimacy to these ideas? It's really fascinating. When you read portions like Guru Gobind Singh wrote extensively about this, by the way. So if we're going to say that, oh, it's not relevant, well, the Guru wrote extensively about it. So as a Sikh, if you're interested in what the Guru's writings are, you're naturally going to be interested in this. But there's a key point here about how it's being repurposed. So Guru Gobind Singh writes, as I mentioned, Krishna Avatar, which is this retelling as his version of the Dasam Granth, the 10th canto of the Bhagavad Purana. But he also wrote his own version of the Ramayana as well, called the Ram Avatar. And at the end of that, so just to give a little bit of context, in Mughal India, the Islam that was being practiced during that time, they felt really conflicted about, the native population considering the divine to be represented in a person. In Islam, they thought this was kind of almost blasphemy. So speaking about Ram, speaking about Krishna could result in some type of conflict. So Guru Gobind Singh, when he's writing Ram Avatar, you can tell a lot by the audience. It's interesting that he writes portions of that Ram Avatar in Farsi, in Persian, so who's his audience? And then at the end of that, there's a line right at the end, the very last line, Saad Asad Jano Nahi Bad Subad Babad, that says, look, I don't know if Ram is Asad, if he's Asad, if he's like the opposite of Asad, if he's a bad person, if he's a good person. Bad Subad Babad. I don't even want to get entangled in this debate about that. So he's exactly saying the same thing. It's saying that debate is not relevant if he's a good person, if he's a bad person, if he even existed. The point of that, the Ram Avatar, I've written a paper on this as well. Hopefully I can talk more about this later on. But the point of Ram Avatar is to inspire a certain martial mindset. And this is true with his Krishna Avatar as well. Taram Yod Ke Chai, he writes at the end, that I desire to have this Taram Yod, this desire, this Cha for Taram Yod in the reader, in the listener. And again, so that tells us how this is being used, that if at the end he's written these nearly 900 verses, I believe, about Ram, and then at the end of that, he's saying, listen, I'm not saying he's a good person or he's a bad person. I'm not even in that debate. But I've created this text to inspire a martial mindset. I think that we can learn a lot from that. We can read between the lines there to see that Guru Gobind Singh, he's not even interested in that discussion, but he's interested in something else, that he's repurposing this. He's talking to an audience that knows about Ram, or perhaps he's talking to an audience that doesn't know about Ram, and he's positioning that in a martial context. So he's talking to people that understand Farsi and whatnot. So we can learn a lot by engaging with Gurbani with this approach, with more of an open kind of a mindset. And it's a great question, really relevant. But yeah, I hope that answers it.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. This question is a bit more technical, really, but what's the difference between Sakya, which is a term that we use a lot, and myths? So maybe we can talk about the language that we use around these things, because Sakya for me are always historic stories, but of course some of them have these kind of very deep mythological imagery within them. And I'm just curious kind of what the language is that we should best use for these things, because in a sense myth is almost a pejorative term, isn't it? And it's almost fair. It's so close to notions of fairy stories or just stories, simple stories. And of course, as you've mentioned, they're much deeper than that. So what's the terminology that you would use, or that perhaps we should start to introduce?
It's a good question. I think we have to think about that carefully. Just as a definition, Sakhi comes from the Sanskrit Sakshi, meaning witness. So when they're talking about this, saying that we have witnessed this, that this has occurred, that in our mind, in our eyes, this is how it took place. Myth is almost in a negative sense associated in the West nowadays. You know, when people talk about myth, it's not something that's even new, this negative association with it. I believe Plato was really against myth in a Greek sense. And for those who want to read more about myth, you can read The Anatomy of Myth. It talks about the history about myth. But the terms that we should use, I think we can just say stories. You know, the way we can kind of understand it is how did Sikh writers in the past talk about it? You know, they said ethos, they said history or stories. So I think that would be in English a good term to use. But yeah, it is something that we should be conscious of, that in the West, myth has a negative connotation in some circles, but I think just restricting it to that negative connotation and having that result in us not engaging with the stories, you know, with the ideas, I think would be doing a disservice. So I think it is something we should think about, but I would just go with stories. Sakya is a good way to talk about it.
That's great, thank you. I'm just going to have this as the last question for this evening. I want to thank you very much for your time as ever. It's a really intense conversation. And I just want to return back to something that you've been working on for the last year, and it continues, and we're very grateful for it. And it forms part of the Mangalacharan project, of course, which is the Suraj Prakash. So it's stepping slightly away from this notion of myth, but of course it's in there. And there is a single episode in your Suraj podcast, which I know you and I talked about shortly after you did it, which was all about myth, and it followed the story that you had of Guru Har Gobind calling upon the winds, the cold winds, to come and defeat the Mughals. And then you took time out of the narrative to actually talk about myth and the merit of myth. So I'd encourage people to do that. But the question is from Vivek Oberoi, and it's the last one for today. He wanted to ask how the Suraj Prakash was historically consumed. Was it a text that was read, or was it primarily narrated? And who were the narrators?
So Suraj Prakash, there's a tradition that those who are reciting, or the way it's consumed basically is through somebody reading it at a gurdwara, at an institution like a takat, and then somebody sitting alongside explaining it, translating that line for line. Now, this is a tradition that has been continued for over 150 years, which is really wild if you think about it, that it was given such high authority that they would almost want the recitation to be done alongside it. So this is different than what you have today, where again, he can come on stage and he can just say whatever he wants, because this text had gone through the people at the time, the top Jathadars, the Gyanis at the time, and basically received a stamp to be like, you know, this is it. Like, this is the way we want to tell the stories about the Guru. Like, this is the way. So stick to this. And it's almost a way of ensuring a certain commonality in the stories that were being told of the Gurus, that they would have it recited. And it's beautifully written. If people know Braj Pasha, Santokh Singh, one of the greatest poets of Braj Pasha, has written arguably the largest Braj Pasha text in history in the Suraj Prakash, which is no small feat. So you get that beauty with the poetry that Santokh Singh is writing. And you also get a little bit of a translation, a context given by the Kathavachak, the one who's doing the discourse. This has become more important as time has gone by. In the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, Braj Pasha as a language in a Sikh context becomes to be used less and less, almost to the point now where you cannot engage with it without some form of translation. But that was not always the case. And when Santokh Singh was writing it, basically the vast majority of Sikh texts were written in that language. And just in a pre-colonial context, we know how manuscripts were being read. They were being read by very few people who had access. Largely, this was consumed by listening. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it does answer the question. Hopefully, it encourages people to subscribe to the Suraj podcast and to look on the Mangalacharan website as well, where you've got some extracts, and also on your YouTube channel where you've got some explanatory material as well. Jvala, it's always an honor to have you on. It's a pleasure. It's been a thrill to have you on for another hour talking about something that honestly many of us would never access or think about. So thank you so much for your generosity with your time and for your scholarship as well. I am sure you'll be back and I look forward to it immensely. So Jvala, thank you very much. For the hundreds of people that joined us tonight, thank you very much indeed as well. Good night.